My name is Bob Mayer, and I was hired 50 years ago in 1969, and I retired 41 years later, almost to the day, on June 24th, 2010. Well, I remember the first day and will forever, because on June 23rd, 1969, which was my first day here, we had to cover one of the biggest stories of that year for sure, and of many years. A plane, a DC-9 Dominicana Airlines plane, crashed on Northwest 36th Street on my very first day at work. 10 people were killed. It destroyed several buildings. It was a horrendous scene. I was an intern on that first day. That's how I was hired. So I wasn't actually in the thick of it reporting or shooting. My job that day, and I vividly remember, was to shuttle film, which is what we used back in 1969, from the scene of the crash to Rela Labs, which was at the site of WTVJ on Northwest 4th Street, so that it could be processed, which took about an hour and a half, or if there was a real emergency, an hour, so we could get it on the air immediately. So I would just go back and forth between the station and the crash site and shuttle the film back to get processed. Well, we did so many things first, it would be hard to recall them all, but of course I think the very first was going on the air. We were the first television station in the state of Florida, beginning in March of 1949. Ralph Rennick, at the time, who was for the next nearly 36 years the anchor and news director at WTVJ, was the first at any station in the country to go on with a nightly editorial. I believe that began in 1957, and that continued until his departure in 1985. I did the very first live field report in 1975, I believe was the year. There was an attempt made on Ronald Reagan's life. He was not president at the time. He was running for president, and he was at the Ramada Inn near the airport. Somebody pulled a gun, and the person was pulled down, and nothing happened. But it was a unique story because I was not sent out to do the station's first live shot. I was sent to cover the story. It was just another candidate, speaking, and they didn't have a photographer to send, so I went alone. I didn't even have a photographer. As it turns out, when this happened, the station decided this was the moment to roll out the live equipment. So the live equipment came out about 2 hours after the incident. The big stage in back of me where Reagan had been speaking had already been dismantled. So I was kind of like out there, almost in an empty field, describing what had happened a couple of hours before. And I have to tell you, being the first time I had ever gone live in the field, I'm surprised you couldn't see my heart pounding because no one had ever done that before. But it went fine. The live truck they sent out was not like the live trucks they have today. It was a gigantic semi with big cameras, and the microphone I was holding was huge, and I remember that the wire coming out of the microphone looked like a garden hose. It was just huge. But I got through it, and that was the beginning of a whole new era. And obviously I got used to it, and so did everybody else, because it became the way news is covered. Yeah, 41 years is a long time to pick the biggest stories, but I think clearly the biggest story, and it was again another violent one, it was another plane crash. At the end of December in 1972, an Eastern Airlines flight 401, crashed in the Everglades. And I got a call. I'd already gone to bed. I think the accident happened shortly before midnight. And I got a call, come on into the station, and I came in. I was there the next day. I was up in a helicopter. Back then, there was not much usable footage you could get at night with the film equipment we had. But as the sun rose the next morning, I was in a chopper shooting. I was not a photographer, but they need me. At that time I wasn't, but they needed a photographer. They needed him on the ground. They needed him in the air. So I took what we called, it was a small silent camera. It did not record sound. It was a Bell and Howell. And I recorded silent film as the sun came up the next morning of the Everglades wreckage that you could clearly see. And it was horrific. And then after that, of course, I went back to the station. We were the very first station to go on the air with any substantive news, with any video. All the reporters that had played a part in the early morning coverage were on the air for a special 1-hour report at 11 a.m. that Ralph Rennick came in to anchor, and all the reporters that were on the story were live on the set for that piece. I think the next biggie was in 1972, in the summer of 1972, Miami Beach hosted both the Republican and the Democratic National Conventions. So that was quite an experience getting to cover those. That was the first time in my life that I had ever been tear gassed. Everyone got tear gassed. If you were in the crowd that they were after and you were a reporter, it didn't make any difference. The experience that I've had over the years covering literally every kind of story certainly contributed to making me who I am today. I think when you are the best, you become an attractive place to work. And TVJ has always been the best. From the time I started in the 1970s, when probably half of our reporting staff ultimately went to the various networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, to even now. I mean, I think right now the people on CBS, Martha Teichner worked here first, now she's with CBS. She's on every Sunday. Tom Yamas anchors for ABC, and of course Kerry Sanders, who was one of our top reporters when he was here, is now a top reporter on NBC, appearing both on NBC Nightly News, on MSNBC. He's all over every day, everywhere, and he's an example of what we produce here, the best. The word that most people use when they talk about Ralph Rennick is pioneer, because he invented television news, certainly in this state and in this community. He set the standards by which everyone followed after that. He was a hell of a guy. In the early years, he was out doing, reporting, heavy reporting. He was the first American journalist to interview Fidel Castro. That was in, I believe, 1959. He had so many firsts over the years. We mentioned the first editorial. As a guy, he was unique. He was a tough boss. He drove his employees, but no less than he drove himself. I mean, we were pushed to be the best. And if we weren't the best, in those days, there were consequences. But the way he operated worked. As a man, he was in the station as news director, aloof. You couldn't always talk to him like, two guys just talking. I remember that if you wanted something from Ralph, if you wanted to do something special, or if you wanted to get a raise, you didn't ask Ralph in the station. You got him outside, you met him at a restaurant for lunch, because once he left this station, once he walked out the doors, he was a different person. He was, he was personable, he could joke, he was one of the guys out of here. But in the station, no way. I mean, to be honest, he was the kind of a guy that, he was very imposing. I mean, he was like 6'4". And when he walked into the newsroom, conversation kind of stopped. Everyone just looked to, what kind of mood is Rennick going to be in today? And if he wasn't in a great mood, if you said good morning, he wouldn't always answer you. But if you caught him outside before he walked in the station, like a different story. Ralph hired the first African-American reporter, C.T. Taylor, who was with us for many, many years, was a terrific guy. Jane Chastain was the first woman sports reporter in this country. And man, did she break ground. She was phenomenal. And while there was some reluctance in the beginning to accept her, she became accepted very quickly because of her knowledge and her personality. It was a great hire. Manolo Reyes, of course, did the Latin news. Before Manolo got the first actual Spanish language program, he translated the Ralph Rennick Report, which was a news program that went on from 6 to 6:30 in English. Every night on WOCN radio, Manolo translated everything Ralph was saying. And that was the start. That was the start. And when they saw that those radio broadcasts in Spanish were getting such high ratings, ultimately they made the decision to give Manolo his own show in Spanish. Put it this way, there are only two people that have made both the Silver Circle Award and the Golden Circle Award. One was Bernie Rose and the other was Bob Weaver. And I was lucky enough to be able to do the introduction to Bob Weaver's Silver Circle Award and his Golden Circle Award, which means you've been working for 50 years. Bob was here for more than 50 years. He was much more than just a weatherman, but he was the weatherman for South Florida. I worked with him, alongside him for more than 30 years. He got me through some very tough spots. There was one time I was called back from Walt Disney World for a hurricane called David that never really materialized, but we thought it would, and I was told I need to go on the air at midnight and stay on the air for the next 12 hours. I was really scared. I'd never been on the air that long before, but they told me I was being paired with Weaver. Weaver came out. I told him how nervous I was. He said, just relax. I'll get you through this. And he got me through however many hours. We were probably on the air together for 10 hours. This man was the epitome of kindness and sweetness. He was the most charitable man I ever knew. I loved the man. There was nothing that he wouldn't do for anybody to help them in whatever way he could. He was a very, very special man.
And he had a bird.
Oh, Weevy the Weatherbird. He started with Weevy the Weatherbird in the early 50s when Weevy was just a tiny little bird with a spring, and Weevy ended up to be much bigger, much larger. And Weevy was on the air with Bob and me and Pam in the morning. At that point, Weevy was like this big, and Weevy had a very distinctive voice. It was Bob Weaver's voice, of course, but it was something like, "Look, it's going to be cloudy." It was crazy. And it was nuts, but we had fun with it, and it was just an indication of who Bob was from the beginning to the end. Yes, it was corny. Everyone knew it was corny, but everybody loved it. We also, on that show, Weaver's other segment on that show was wishing people happy birthday. Every day he'd wish somebody else happy birthday. And we'd sing the happy birthday song until we were told we couldn't do it because of copyright infringement. I consider myself a very lucky man to have landed this job. I went to work for WTVJ immediately out of college and basically spent most of my life here. And I always considered it the pinnacle of professionalism, the pinnacle of journalism. We had leeway that really no other station had because of the stature initially created by Ralph Rennick, because, no less importantly, because of the ratings that we had in those days. We would garner in the 1970s and early 80s more than 50% of the audience on any given night. And because of that, we had leeway. In the 70s and 80s, most of my reporting was consumer-oriented. And when you do consumer reporting, you can alienate businesses. It happens a lot. I was always told by Ralph Rennick, I always checked with him before I ran something, and if it was going to provide negative news for a business or a product, I would always check with him first. In those days, we didn't have to worry about the advertising department. Never. Rennick would just say, if it's true, go with it, and we'll take the consequences. One particular thing that comes to mind, the story where it really had a consequence was, I did a story, and it was a story about rusting Fords back in 1980. There was a class action lawsuit started here by our then consumer advocate, Walter Dartland, suing Ford Motor Company for premature rust on Ford products. When he called the news conference to announce the suit, it was controversial because it would go against, we had every Ford retailer advertised with us. There was something back then called the Big 10 Ford dealers, which represented every Ford dealer in Dade and Broward counties. They objected. Somehow they found out this was coming, and they objected and called Rennick and told Rennick if we ran the story, they would pull their advertising. I had a conversation with Rennick. He said, "Is this all true? Is there anything that could be questioned?" "No, Ralph. Go with the story. We'll take the consequences." Sure enough, I ran the story, and the Big 10 Ford dealers pulled a package worth, back then it was a lot of money, a $100,000 advertising package. And the view that Rennick held, and even the sales department in those days, is that this may be a temporary hit, but we'll get it back because this ultimately is helping the consumers. And 6 months later, the Big 10 Ford dealers came back with all their advertising. So that gave people like me and other reporters a sense of freedom that may not exist today. My love was consumer reporting and consumer stories. From the very beginning in the early 70s until my retirement year in 2010, the stories that I did involved helping people, and I got the platform to do that at WTVJ. I think over the years, the most impactful thing that I did was a series called Not on the Menu, which we started in 1973. We went back 2 or 3 more times over the years and did it again, where I would follow health inspectors in Dade and Broward and inspect, I never chose the restaurants, and inspect restaurants for cleanliness. And the first year we did it, 62% of the restaurants in the 2 counties failed inspection. It was impactful because we got laws changed on both the local and state level. Health inspectors did not have the power to close dirty restaurants prior to that series, and they got it. Within 3 months of the start of that series, they got that power. Over the years, we were the first in the country to do this. Over the years, that concept has spread to many, many stations around the country and is actually still going on in this town. There's another station in town that still does it 46 years later. They hated me. One restaurant I remember had a sign outside saying, "Bob Mayer, WTVJ, welcome anytime." The other thing that I didn't mention was testing new cars. I started testing new cars in 1974. Back in those days, I used to drive a different new car every week for the first 4 months of every model year. And I did that. I can't tell you the hundreds of new cars that I tested over a 35 or 40 year period. It was great, and I was completely honest. That was a truly fun job to have, testing new cars. The other part of my career was anchoring, because I anchored for most of my 41 years here. I anchored, I think, pretty much all the shows. The last 20 years, I anchored the morning show. I had many wonderful co-anchors over those decades. But there was one that really stood out. It was the perfect pairing, I think, of news anchors. My last 8 or 8.5 years here, I anchored with Pam Gigante. And from day one, I knew that this was the nirvana of news anchoring partners, because we thought so much alike. We could finish each other's sentences. If somebody got into trouble and couldn't finish for some reason or couldn't pronounce something right, one of us would just openly tell the other what was going on. And it didn't appear odd or weird. It was just, we were a TV couple. I mean, that's what we were, a TV couple. There were several instances over the years, this didn't happen every day, where one of us would be reading a story and it was very funny. And one of us would start laughing. And in 1 or 2 instances, couldn't stop. So the other one would just move in and take over, even if it was the other script, me, her, or her, me, and finish the script. And sometimes we both ended up laughing. When I think of my years here, and I think of all the shows I anchored, the most fun was that morning show. I had to get up at 1:45 in the morning. I live in South Dade. I had to get up, get dressed, put makeup on, drive to Broward County. I hated getting up in the morning for 20 years. I hated getting up, but the most fun part of my day was sitting behind that set with Pam. Everything changed. Everything became worth it when Pam and I sat down, because we felt comfortable with each other and it was enjoyable. I mean, it was really it was fun. Happy anniversary, WTVJ. Happy 70th, and keep it up.